All right, hello and welcome to another Shannon Law Group webinar on vaccine injury compensation program. This is the third one we've done this year in our quarterly webinar series. And today we're going to be focusing on Guillain-Barre Syndrome, or GBS, as you're likely going to be referred to from here on out. This is one of the more common vaccine injuries that we see, only because it's associated with the flu shot, and that's the vaccination that most Americans get every year. So obviously we're very familiar with GBS claims, both in the vaccine injury compensation program, how they are prosecuted, how they are reviewed, but also we're intimately aware of what happens during a GBS case and what happens to the individual. So we're going to be touching on both Guillain-Barre syndrome in general, what the condition is like, and then we're going to focus a little bit more on how to navigate the vaccine injury compensation program if you are unfortunate enough to develop Guillain-Barre syndrome following a flu shot or other vaccine. With me today is our attorney Rhonda, and I'm sure you've spoken to her on a number of occasions. Great attorney for us, great advocate, and she's got a lot of information about this Guillain-Barre syndrome that she'd like to share with you. So without further ado, Rhonda, why don't you take it away?
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Jonathan. Welcome, everyone. And basically, we're just going to get right down to it because we know your time is valuable. Thank you for spending some time with us. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to briefly go over just a little bit of the background of the VICP, which is also known as the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. And then I'm going to begin to just briefly tell you where GBS fits in there, okay? So just as a little background, the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program began in 1986 with the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. And they wanted to create a no-fault compensation program that was designed to encourage vaccinations and to encourage manufacturers to create vaccines. At that time, manufacturers were threatening to slow down production or to not spend as much time and effort in this area. And Congress decided that this was an area that it didn't want them to do that in. In order to incentivize them, they created this program that provides a level of immunity to them from being sued. So if you get injured by one of the vaccines that are listed in this program, you are unable to initially sue the vaccine manufacturer or the vaccine administrator, so the person giving it to you. You must go through this claims process to begin. And to make it fair to those that are injured, what they did is they then created a 75-cent tax that's was put on all covered vaccines when you get them, and they put it in a trust fund called the Vaccine Injury Compensation Trust Fund. So they created this big pool of money that, as people get these vaccines, grows and grows and grows. And then they put it in the hands of the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS, to be in charge of divvying out money from this program in this no-faults system. In order to do this fairly, they also created a division in the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, where this court helps to administer the vaccine injury claims that are filed against the HHS to recover for injuries, so that everything's done as fairly as possible. Now, it should be stressed that there are only certain vaccines that are covered by this program, and those are the vaccines that are routinely recommended. Whoops, sorry. Let me go back. 1 second. There's somebody here. Admit. Okay. Only the vaccines that are routinely recommended to children. Now, that doesn't mean that children are the ones restricted to filing claims, because many of the vaccines given to children are recommended for children are also given to adults. And in fact, the majority of the claims in this program are claims that have been filed by adults. It's just that they've limited it to only those vaccines that are routinely recommended to children, because there's like a ton of vaccines out there. So right now, there's only 17 categories of vaccines that are covered by this program. What Congress did is it created this vaccine injury table that will quickly show you what vaccines are included in the program in the first column. In the second column, it shows what injuries have been scientifically or by policy have been associated with each of these vaccines. And in the third column of this table, it shows the time period in which symptoms from your injury should have appeared in order for it to be presumed caused by the vaccine. So if you fit within this table, where you have this a covered vaccine, you have one of the injuries that are listed in the vaccine, and your symptoms appeared within the time listed in the table, you are considered to have a table injury, and in which case, if everything goes okay, causation is presumed in your case. That's why it's a no-fault program, because if you fit nice and neatly within the parameters of this table, you don't have to prove causation. You don't have to prove your injury was caused. You get to go on right away and to determine what your damages are. Now, if you have an injury that's not on the table, or the injury occurs outside of the time frame suggested in the table, then you're considered to have an off-table case, where as the petitioner in the case, you'd have the burden of proving that the vaccine actually caused the injury. So there's another level of proof. And as to recognize that this takes some expertise, the program also allows the fund not just to cover your damages, but to cover your attorney's fees. So the good news is you don't have to pay attorney's fees, but you get the benefits of a skilled attorney, like someone from Shannon Law Group, who's admitted to practice in this particular area of law in this particular court. And you get them to help you navigate your way through this system to try to fight for what you should be compensated for. And then at the end, the fund will pay out for your attorney's fees. There are a couple of 4 main requirements. There's a few more, but these are some of the major requirements in order to file a claim within the program. As I've already said, you have to have one of the covered vaccines. And as of right now, there are 17 categories. Cases, you need to go through a whole judicial process and a lot of things to happen to add another vaccine to this table, and it can happen for sure. But like as of right now, COVID-19 vaccines are not covered into this program. Shingles, because that's only for adults, it's not a child recommended vaccine, that's not covered. Rabies isn't covered, etc. If it's not recommended for on the children's table, then it's not covered currently in the program. The program is meant to compensate you if you have a more severe injury. And the way they define that is your injury has to last at least 6 months. So if you do have an injury and after 4 months it goes away and you're back to 100%, you can't file within the program to be compensated for that injury. It's intended for more major injuries that last 6 months or beyond. And you need something more than your affidavit or your testimony to prove that. The best way to prove that is through your medical records, that you're still receiving medical care. The third requirement in order to file a claim in the program is you have to file it within the statute of limitations. And if you have an injury as opposed to death, you have to file it within 3 years of your vaccination or the first manifestation of your symptoms. And then 4, the vaccine generally has to be received within the United States. There's a few exceptions to that, but we won't go into those. Now, this is what the table looks like that I just described you with the 3 columns. The first column is the vaccine. The second column is the injury. And the third column is when the symptoms should start occurring for that injury. And as you can see, I've clipped the portion of the table that deals with influenza, seasonal influenza vaccines. And the reason is because One of the recognized injury that you can get from the flu vaccine, as Jonathan already introduced to you, is this Guillain-Barre Syndrome, or GBS. The time period where they expect you to start showing symptoms for GBS is 3 to 42 days. Now that means not less than 3 and not more than 42. And you might be saying, at first, when I first learned about Guillain-Barre syndrome, I thought, well, that's kind of odd. Why wouldn't you, why is it worse to have symptoms earlier than 3 days? You would think, oh, if it's associated with it, wouldn't you be having symptoms right away? Or why would you not get symptoms for almost 42 days? That's quite a long period of time. When you learn a little bit about what Guillain-Barre syndrome, that will make a lot more sense. So we'll get to that in a second. I also want to point out that Guillain-Barre syndrome is only on the table for seasonal influenza vaccines. Now, does that mean you can't file a petition if you get Guillain-Barre syndrome after another vaccine, like like a tetanus vaccine or something else? No, you can still file a claim. However, it's just not a table claim, like I explained before. You will have to prove causation. You will have to probably get some kind of expert authority, testimony, articles, something along that nature, or at least your attorney will, proving that that condition, Guillain-Barre syndrome, is somehow connected to the vaccine that you got, and expert opinion showing that in your particular case, you have an expert saying your Guillain-Barre syndrome is more than likely created by that vaccine. So there's levels of proof that are involved. I just, for the purposes of our brief seminar here today, I just wanted to get you familiar with what a table injury is, which is something where causation you won't have to prove, and it's already listed in the program. So Guillain-Barre syndrome is listed in the program for influenza vaccines, and what makes it easier for it to get through that program. So within the program, within the VICP, they've created a special processing unit, which was originally made to help streamline and expedite the cases through the program. Like most government programs, there's a huge backlog. There's a variety of symptoms or reasons for that, but it does take cases quite a while to get through the program under most cases, average of like 1 to 3 years. But they can be expedited more toward the 1 year mark or the lower end of that stream if they're in the SPU. So if you have a table case, those are the kind of cases that they normally want to put in the SPU, and then they will hopefully go through the system quicker. When you file a claim in the VICP, there are 2 phases. I've already kind of intimated to that. The first phase is to show entitlement. Are you entitled to be compensated anything? Is there a causation that's been shown? Well, as I said earlier, if it's on the table and it all fits neatly in the table, causation is presumed, and phase 1 should theoretically be over and you can go right to the damages. If you don't have a table case, then you have to spend time at this first phase to prove entitlement before you go on to damages. And then when you get to damages, there are 4 main categories of damages you can get. Past out-of-pocket expenses. The insurance companies don't need to be paid back in general, but you get to be paid back what you paid out of pocket. So that's good, because lots of times you have co-pays, lots of times maybe insurance doesn't cover something. And so you get out-of-pocket expenses. And in a lot of GBS cases, there can be a lot of out-of-pocket expenses. If you get a GBS case that's on the more severe side, you may have a lot of caretaking expenses. You may have expenses for having to, alter your environment in order to compensate for your injuries, such as, a specialized car or specialized transportation or something like that. So that's really good. You get those out-of-pocket expenses back if you can show it was associated to your injury. Lost earnings or wages you get past, and if you can prove future, you can get future ones. You can get future medical costs if you can prove that you will have medical costs in the future, and it's more than likely you will, or more than most likely certain that you will. And the biggest component, usually it's the biggest component, is the pain and suffering. Because this is a no-fault program, it is capped. It is capped at $250,000 for pain and suffering. Usually that's good enough to cover a lot of pain and suffering in a lot of cases, but unfortunately in some of these GBS cases where they really have catastrophic damages that might affect them for the rest of their life, it's unfortunate that it's capped like that, but fortunately right now there's some legislation, hopefully fingers crossed, where they're going to increase that pain and suffering amount. But as of right now and for the foreseeable near future, it's still capped at $250,000. And just briefly, now let's get into Guillain-Barre syndrome. Generally, it's just a rare disorder in which your body's immune system attacks your nerves, okay? So what does that look like? So here's a picture of what a normal nerve looks like, where you have the fibers inside that are encased in a myelin sheath. So it's kind of like a really thick extension cord, where you ever see those big orange extension cords, especially those outdoor ones, they're really hardy. They have a really, really thick sheath around them to protect the cords going through the middle of the extension cord. And the purpose is so that signals can go from one end of the cord to the other without any interruption. Same with our nerves. So this sheath is to protect the fibers inside so that the nerves can transmit signals throughout the body in an effective way. Well, if the body is attacking those nerves, it can expose the fiber. So if you look at the bottom picture where they have a damaged myelin, the fiber gets exposed. You know, if you can picture that extension cord and you can picture a little mouse gnawing away at it, you can imagine that it's going to take a while for the mouse to gnaw away at an extension cord, right? You wouldn't expect within the first minute that the mouse is going to make much of a dent in this huge, you know, this really thick extension cord. It might take a day, it might take a week, it might take a month. It's got to get through the outside before it hits the fibers, before something happens. So if the extension cord is attached to, let's say, a light, maybe all of a sudden the light starts going on and off and flickering and it starts damaging things, or I'm sorry, it starts acting erratically. And then eventually, if the fibers are destroyed enough in the extension cord, the light will go off altogether. Similar to our bodies, we will start experiencing these symptoms and it'll take a while. That's why we go back to that 3 to 42 days. If you have symptoms right away, your nerve most likely is not damaged from something that just happened, because it takes a while for that sheath to be eaten away at and to expose those fibers and to start making a difference in how the messages are going through those fibers in your body. And here's just a brief additional picture of that. So when the nerve can't transmit signals really well, some of the typical symptoms, and Jonathan will probably go into more detail about this when we get to his portion of the program, are weakness and tingling in your extremities. So the nerves can create pain, weakness, tingling, and eventually paralysis. And usually, like lots of times, it starts in your hands and your feet, and then it moves its way up. In more severe cases, it goes into paralysis. And then it can actually affect your breathing and your digestive system. But if you start getting paralysis where it's affecting your breathing, you can imagine how serious that can be. And if you have paralysis in your legs, you can also imagine how serious that can be in order to try to regain that function back again. So on the table, they define each term, and of course they get very technical. So they call it an acute monophasic peripheral neuropathy, which is just kind of a fancier way of calling it a neurological injury. And they list 4 different subtypes for it, which I'm not going to get into right now. They also explain once again that you expect to see symptoms from GBS begin no less than 3 days, because it usually takes time for that to wear through the nerve, the myelin sheath of the nerve, and up to 42 days. Because if you have a process that's going really fast, it could be 3 days. If you have a process that's gnawing away at it really, really slowly, it could take some time. But beyond 42 days, apparently the literature shows it's not really likely that it's caused back 42 days earlier from the vaccine. And so then they assume that it could be caused by something else. The interval between the first time you see symptoms and the nadir of the weakness, meaning its lowest point, is between 12 hours and 28 days. So you could start showing symptoms, quickly go down to it being at its worst in 12 hours, and then it either leveling or getting better. So the next point is, after that nadir, it's followed by a clinical plateau where it stops progressing with stabilization, or a subsequent improvement where it starts getting better without any significant relapse. So relapse means, everything goes really bad and then it gets better, and then it goes really bad again and then it's better. They tend to call that a different neurological issue than Guillain-Barre syndrome, and only Guillain-Barre syndrome is on the table. And death might occur without it actually plateauing. So if you're going, if it's affecting you bad enough, it can create death, unfortunately, and we've seen those cases. So as I said before, GBS is listed on the table as an injury only for the seasonal influenza vaccine. If a GBS is caused in your case or someone's case by a different vaccine, which you believe is caused by the other vaccine, it could still be covered by the VICP, but it would be a non-table case requiring that additional proof we discussed. And so that's the end of my portion of the presentation. I'm going to hand this back over to Jonathan, and he's going to continue on explaining more about GBS and how they go through the system. So Jonathan, I'm going to give you back the controls. There we go.
Thank you, Rhonda. All right, so I noticed we had a couple of audience members here following along with us. If anybody has a question during this presentation, feel free to use the chat function on our Zoom platform here. We will address any questions at the end of our presentation. All right, so I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, so Rhonda went through, some of the basics of the VICP, and then kind of started to get into, what GBS looks like from a symptomatology standpoint. So I'm going to kind of pick up where she left off. Some of this might, overlap a little bit, but it never hurts to hear it twice. Okay, so now let's assume, for a second that if somebody gets a flu shot, and between 3 and 42 days later, like Rhonda said, we would expect that person, if they are developing GBS due to a flu shot, to start experiencing those initial symptoms. And the initial symptoms are going to be numbness, tingling in the extremities, weakness in the extremities, fatigue, unsteady gait. You're kind of dragging when you walk. You may even experience some difficulty breathing or difficulty swallowing, depending on the severity of the injury. And if you're experiencing these symptoms, obviously it's important to get medical treatment as soon as possible. Whether you're going to your primary care doctor's office or to the hospital, most likely you're going to get some kind of clinical diagnosis first. And in my experience seeing these GBS cases, that can be hit or miss, whether or not you're initially getting a proper diagnosis, because these symptoms can overlap with other things. It can overlap with a back injury and some other conditions. So the only way to truly confirm, a GBS diagnosis is with either a lumbar puncture or a nerve conduction study, or both. So usually what happens is your symptoms, your symptoms are progressing, right? So the numbness and tingling is progressing from your feet up to your torso. your weakness is getting worse. You're maybe getting some difficulty breathing or swallowing. At that point, it becomes an emergency situation. And that's when, if in a hospital setting, they're going to try a lumbar puncture or a spinal tap. And in that procedure, a needle is inserted into the space between your lumbar vertebrae. And they're going to remove some cerebrospinal fluid so that it can be tested for inflammation. They do this for other conditions, but in the context of a GBS case, they're testing it for the level of protein in that cerebrospinal fluid. And if the protein levels are high enough that it can confirm a diagnosis of GBS. Obviously, it would confirm it if you had some other clinical presentation. In addition to a lumbar puncture, your doctors may perform an EMG or nerve conduction study. It's another way to confirm a diagnosis of GBS, to confirm neuropathy. They will measure the activity between your nerves and muscles, or the signal strength. So these are two ways in which, in a hospital setting, that we commonly see GBS diagnosed. Rhonda mentioned this during her presentation. On the vaccine injury table, there are subtypes of Guillain-Barre syndrome that are listed. It's more informational than anything. In my experience, doctors are sometimes stopping short of getting too particular with GBS. They'll confirm a diagnosis of GBS, and I think because this first subtype, acute inflammatory demyelinating polyneuropathy, or AIDP, is 90% of cases in the United States. That's usually going to be the assumption. Is that's what it is. And in my experience, most of the cases that I see follow that clinical presentation as well, where you're seeing numbness, tingling, weakness in the extremities. That's kind of the hallmark of that subtype. The other subtypes, Miller-Fisher syndrome, which is actually characterized by some inflammation in the eyes. Very rarely do we see something like that. It's more common in Asia. And then acute motor axonal neuropathy, also found outside the United States. So most of the time, we're just dealing with the AIDP subtype of GBS. However, any one of these subtypes can be associated with the influenza vaccine and are encompassed under that Guillain-Barre syndrome condition that's listed on the table. So you're in the hospital, they've confirmed you have GBS. What are your treatment options? There isn't a cure for GBS. These are treatment options that will help reduce the inflammation. So the most common are a plasma exchange, where the plasma portion of your blood is removed and replaced with new plasma, with the hope that the harmful antibodies in the old plasma have been removed. The other common treatment is IVIG therapy, where healthy donor antibodies are administered intravenously. In both of these cases, I've seen very, very good results. And typically it'll be a 5-day course, whether you do plasma exchange or IVIG. And again, we're not curing the GBS with this, but when Rhonda's talking about the nadir of your symptoms, hopefully this makes it less severe. And so it's a faster road to recovery when you do reach that plateau. So after you've undergone one of these two treatments, and the symptoms of your GBS are more or less constant, or you've reached that plateau, it's time to start the long road to regaining your physical strength, your functional ability. And so most of the time, we see patients undergoing physical therapy, occupational therapy. And if the condition did affect either your speech or your ability to swallow, you may undergo some speech therapy as well. And obviously, this is kind of self-explanatory, but physical therapy, we're focused on regaining strength, endurance, balance, coordination, range of motion, things like that. Occupational therapy is more to do with adapting to new normals. Whether you need help with transfers from your chair to the shower, the chair to the toilet, chair to bed, things like that. Getting acclimated with different assistive devices, and more of some functional aspects of daily life that we're working on in occupational therapy. Speech therapy, obviously self-explanatory there. So yeah, this kind of treatment is the hardest, I think. You're going to be for months going to sometimes multiple times a day therapy sessions with different therapists, and trying to get as much back as you can. So as far as recovery goes, if GBS is adequately treated, what we see is that most individuals will experience a full recovery within a year. Obviously, some patients will have some residual symptoms, some residual functional deficits, whether it's maybe they're walking a little bit more slowly or more carefully, their gait isn't the same, or their strength in their extremities isn't the same. But more or less, the good news is that if it's treated adequately, most of GBS patients do make a full recovery. So in the context of the VICP, what makes a quote unquote good GBS case? And Rhonda hit on all of these things. This is the table criteria that we're talking about. Onset between 3 and 42 days. That diagnosis that I talked about, that's going to become really important. They're going to look at your medical records and make sure that we have a confirmed case of GBS. Most of the time it's going to take more than a suspected case of GBS. If you go see your primary care doctor and you say you've got some weakness, you had the flu shot recently, and they say maybe it's GBS, but you don't really do anything to confirm that, and maybe it's a mild case and it's something that you can kind of live with. That's going to be a difficult case to prove. We need something more. We need either a neurological examination where they're testing some neuropathy, and obviously the best indication would be either a lumbar puncture or an EMG type study. And then the severity requirement that Rhonda mentioned. So most GBS cases, you're going to have symptoms for at least 6 months. I have seen some individuals make a really, really good recovery. And, maybe 4 or 5 months later, they're essentially back to normal. And what I would caution people with is, don't give up on a claim too early. If you don't feel like you're 100% back to your baseline after GBS, then you're still dealing with symptoms. The important thing would be to make sure you document those and following up with your doctors, seeing your treatment all the way through. Don't give up on therapy. Don't miss a follow-up appointment just because you're feeling good. If you're still having even minor symptoms, it's important to get all the treatment that's required. So as Rhonda mentioned, there's 2 phases to the VICP. There's the entitlement phase and the damages phase. Now, most of the time we're looking, for table cases because that presumption of causation is so crucial to the success of a lot of the petitions that get filed in the program. So as you can imagine, the government who defends the fund their job is, to weed out cases, obviously, that aren't appropriate for compensation. Sometimes they get a little overzealous, though, and they will try and find issues or create issues that may not even be there. So what they'll try to do is find issues with onset. If let's say you started to feel fatigue or maybe even some weakness prior to that third day, and that's somewhere in your medical records, they're going to make an issue out of that, even if your diagnosis came much later. Same thing, if you wait to go see a doctor until after 42 days, and you're kind of right on that border, they might make an issue out of that too. So they're sticklers about the onset issue. Unclear diagnosis. So remember, it's always good to get as clear of a diagnosis as you can. When we file a petition, we're alleging a particular condition was caused by a vaccine. We have to allege that condition with specificity. And if it's not Guillain-Barre syndrome, or that's not supported by the medical records, then they're going to make an issue out of that. So we can't just claim you have GBS without corroboration from the medical records. Another thing that happens sometimes is what might appear to be Guillain-Barre syndrome in the beginning turns into something else. I've seen this with some individuals where Guillain-Barre syndrome is included in the beginning as a differential diagnosis. Maybe even months later, follow up with a neurologist, they say, this doesn't look like Guillain-Barre syndrome. I think this is something like chronic inflammatory demyelinating polyneuropathy, or CIDP. Once you have more than one diagnosis or two different diagnoses, the government's going to latch on to that, and they're going to say, well, this isn't GBS because he was diagnosed with CIDP. So differing diagnoses can work against you in the program. So it's always best to have a clear GBS diagnosis going into this program. I mentioned lack of severity. Just see your treatment all the way through. Most of the time, you're going to be having some kind of symptoms 6 months out. The other issue is delayed or inconsistent treatment. So this kind of goes hand in hand with lack of severity. If you're someone who doesn't like going to the doctor, I'm one of those someones. You might think, I don't need all this therapy. I'm just going to stay at home and do my exercises, and I'll make it out of this okay. The lack of medical records can create a lot of problems in this program. So if you wait, to get this diagnosis confirmed, or you're non-compliant with their treatment recommendations, whether it's therapy or otherwise, that can create issues for you in the entitlement phase. So assuming we don't have any of those issues, and we've got a good GBS case, we make it through the entitlement phase. Now we're talking about damages. Rhonda told you about the categories of damages here, and I'm going to focus a little bit more, on GBS in particular. So out-of-pocket expenses speak for themselves, same with lost wages or earnings. Although I would say, with lost wages or earnings or income, definitely more of a factor in a GBS case than other cases. This can require inpatient hospitalization. It can require inpatient physical therapy, and you may be out of work for a while. If you work, a blue collar type job, this might prevent you from doing that job. It might even prevent you from going back to that job when you're done with treatment. So, the lost wages or lost income in a GBS case can be a significant amount of compensation. For pain and suffering damages, the factors to consider in a GBS case, and these are all factors that the court is considering, and they will spell out exactly why this case is worth this much. They're going to say, here's the treatment that was required. So they underwent plasma exchange. They did 3 months of physical and occupational therapy on an inpatient basis. They did another 4 months of it on an outpatient basis. And they're going to look into all the treatment that you went through. They're going to look at any complications that were caused by GBS. A lot of patients develop incontinence or respiratory issues that are associated with GBS. So, if you had a complication that can be traced back to your GBS, that will be a factor in your pain and suffering. Reported symptoms. This is one that I preach to all of our clients. When you're in pain, tell the doctor you're in pain. When you're experiencing a symptom, tell them what the symptom is. Explain it to them. A lot of times I think we will downplay what we're going through because we don't want to sound like we're complaining. But the court's going to look at your medical records, and they're going to see, on this day he was reporting these symptoms. On this day he was reporting these symptoms. And if you're saying you're fine, or you're saying, I'm doing okay when you're not, they're going to, look at the medical records and take your word for it. So that's something that, I preach to all of our clients. And same goes with, when you're at 6 months or longer, when you're in the throes of this and you're dealing with the worst of it, and you reach a point at the end where you're much better than what you were, when you were going through this in the hospital. It may feel like you're, 100% recovered, but you got to think back to the day before you went to or started developing symptoms, or the day before you got that flu shot. How did you feel that day? Are you back to that baseline? And if you're not, you've got to report those symptoms. Functional or occupational deficits. I talked about this. There's going to be some things that during your recovery you can't do as well anymore, whether it's walking, reaching for things, transferring, things like that. And they're going to look at all that stuff. The more dependent you are on assistance, the bigger factor that is for pain and suffering. There are cases where the courts consider psychological effects too. This is a significant injury, and it can cause depression. It can cause anxiety, and the more you lose that normal life, that life that you were accustomed to, the more that it can affect those things. Especially if you were 100% independent before this, and you're coming out of it having to rely on other people, and it can take a toll mentally. So they'll look at those things too. Residual symptoms, obviously, we talked about that. If the judge is considering your case or considering the damages, and at the time they're considering it, you're still having symptoms, they can consider future pain and suffering. So these are all factors that the court considers when they're coming up with the amount for pain and suffering. So as far as what to expect in a GBS case, Rhonda mentioned there's a cap, so 250,000 maximum. There have been cases that get awarded a 250 maximum. Obviously, we're talking about permanent limitations, assistive devices that you're required to use now. In some cases, you lose your employment, or you're dependent on family members or other care providers. Those are the cases that are reserved for that maximum. There's two ways to get to an award. There's a settlement or a proffer where before you get to the judge's decision, the government is going to offer you what they call a proffer. And so they're doing their own calculation on the value of your pain and suffering, the value of your other damages. And it's a one-time offer. They're making it to take it or leave it proposition. Obviously, most of the time it'll be somewhat less than what you might be able to get in front of the judge. And they're hoping that you consider time to be a factor in getting that compensation. But that's something that you would talk to your attorney about, whether they think it's appropriate, the amount that the government's offering. If you want to reject that proffer, you have different ways of getting in front of the judge for them to decide your case, and we call them special masters. So they can decide it after a hearing where they're hearing testimony, or they can decide it after your just briefing, where your attorney is submitting a brief, outlining exactly why we think you're entitled to this much amount of compensation, and the government will submit their own brief in opposition. So when it's all said and done, the spectrum for GBS cases most recently has been between the max 250 and 125,000 for those milder cases. From the Office of the Special Masters, they released some data from in 2020 showing that the median award for GBS cases was $161,771.44. So that's what you can kind of expect in a GBS case, obviously, with no other entitlement issues, if we're just talking about damages. Just to kind of wrap up here, the benefits of this program are, number one, you get to have access to a experienced attorney for free. You're not paying them anything, whether you're successful or unsuccessful. There's not any contingency fee attached to your award or settlement. And you never have to worry about it. You never have to worry about paying your attorney, them tracking you down to pay any bills or anything like that. Rhonda mentioned no need to prove negligence or fault, especially in a case like GBS where you're just getting a vaccine. There's really nobody's at fault here. So not having to establish that element is nice. In a context of medical negligence or medical malpractice, it should be a difficult case. The presumption of causation on a table case is huge. In a flu GBS case, I can tell you that the government, will concede those cases if you meet the table criteria, because it's pretty cut and dry. When you get a flu vaccine, if you develop those symptoms in that time period, there's not much that they can say to argue away that. And then the other thing, this is kind of up to the individual, but what I've found is what I like about the VICP is that my clients can focus on their recovery. They don't really have to get too involved in the litigation. There's no deposition testimony that you have to give, or you're not going to court. So you get to focus on just getting better and going to your doctor's appointments and you're creating that record of your symptoms and how this injury impacts you, and let your attorney handle all the aspects of the litigation. So see if I have anything else here. No. Okay. Let me check. See if we've got any questions here. I don't see anybody that has left a question in the chat. Rhonda, did you have anything you wanted to add before we sign off here?
No, I think we've covered it, and I think we kind of like reiterated the important things twice. So anyone can always contact our office if you'd like a consultation. We give free consultations. And in addition, we have an upcoming book. Do you want to talk about that, Jonathan?
Yeah, so before we get to that, I do see Mr. McKinnon has left a question here in the chat. What if it happened at the VA? So the only requirement really is that you get your vaccine in the United States. Doesn't matter if it was at the VA. We have a number of clients that received vaccines at the VA that we're helping out. So there's no, I understand it's also a government kind of process there, but there's no nothing to be worried about when we're dealing with the VA.
Yeah, the purpose of the program is to, like I said, it was kind of like a compromise, so that you don't have the ability to go after the manufacturers or the people that administered it. So you get to dip into this other government program to be compensated for your injuries if you can prove it was a vaccine injury. So actually, and that's a good point, because sometimes your medical providers, and I'm not sure this is what you're saying, but sometimes medical providers want to be really helpful, and sometimes they're really leery. And I think it's because they're afraid that maybe they could be in trouble for doing something. And I don't think they realize that they cannot be sued, that by helping you with your claim here, you could actually, they're just helping you. They're helping you to get what you should be compensated for without bringing any liability on their own part.
Just to piggyback off that, because we're the table criteria is what it is. There's no element here where we need to show a medical provider saying this patient's GBS was caused by the flu shot. So if you get your medical records, you're going through it and you're looking for anybody who's made that connection. As long as you meet the other table criteria, that it's not required. All we need to show is you got a flu vaccine, you develop symptoms, within that window, and you get a diagnosis of GBS. Nobody has to take that extra step to make that causation opinion. And so if you're getting frustrated with your doctor and your doctor's saying, well, I don't know, it could be, could not be, that's something that you don't really have to concern yourself with. All right. Well, if you're watching this on YouTube and it sparks some questions, feel free to leave a comment or contact us via phone, email, and let us know, and we'll try and get back to you. As Rhonda mentioned, we do have a book coming out that's going to be about SIRVA, or shoulder injury related to vaccine administration. Kind of off topic here, but keep your eyes open for that. We also have, another book that I wrote about a year and a half ago about the VICP, how it works. So if you want a free copy of that, reach out to us. We can send that out to you. And then, I'd invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Other than these webinars, we put out other informational videos from time to time. We'll be doing another webinar next quarter. And if you want, feel free to leave a comment. If you got a suggestion on a topic, if there's something that you want to hear about, some aspect of the vaccine injury compensation program that you want some more detail about, feel free to let us know. Anything else, Rhonda?
Nope. Just everyone have a great day.
Yeah, thank you for those of us, or for those of you who joined us. And I'm sure we'll be seeing you again soon. Take care.